Good evening. I am Xavier Salomon, the Deputy Director and Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator at the Frick Collection. Welcome to this episode of Cocktails with a Curator. This evening, I am going to be talking about this exquisite small object, a tiny teapot, brown and with this sort of wonderful geometric shape and these sort of facets that are sort of almost sort of carved into it. Which make it into this beautiful small object. But why talk about a single teapot? And the reason I'm doing that is because the story behind this teapot and many other objects like it is a really extraordinary story for art in Europe in general. And it's a story of the discovery of porcelain in the early 18th century in Germany, in the city of Dresden. Now, because we're talking about Dresden, the origins of porcelain, and we're talking about this object in particular and a series of other objects of the Meissen manufactory, which were given to the Frick collection by the great German collector, Henry Arnhold. And I would like to thank Henry and his family for their generosity, for allowing the museum to have this incredible group of objects, one of the most significant donations to the museum in its recent life. Because of this, I've decided to pair this with a cocktail that's called the Saxon cocktail. I'm not entirely sure why it's called the Saxon, but it is made out of rum, grenadine, and lime juice, and it's garnished with an orange. So I would like to raise a glass in memory of Henry Arnhold and to the Arnhold family to thank them for all their support and their love of the Frick collection. Cheers. So the story of porcelain really begins in Europe in the 13th century. And it begins with one man, the voyage of one man and members of his family, a Venetian man, Marco Polo, who travels to the east, to China, in the 13th century. And Marco Polo, coming back from China, brings a number of objects and writes his memoirs of that travel. And in the memoirs, he recounts and describes for the first time many Asian objects, customs, buildings that no one in Europe had really heard about before that. And one of the things he describes is, for the first time in Europe, porcelain. And Marco Polo writes that in China, they collect a certain kind of earth, as it were from a mine, and laying it at a great heap, they suffer it to be exposed to the wind, the rain, and the sun for 30 or 40 years, during which time it is never disturbed. By this time, it becomes refined and fit for being wrought into vessels. And so this description of this specific type of clay that is left exposed to the elements with which this specific type of vessels are made is the first description of what we now know as porcelain. And it is Marco Polo who describes this material as porcellane, and that is linked to the description of a shell, a cowrie shell, which was known under a similar name. And because porcelain, the surface of it looks a little bit like this type of shell, that's how the name came about. This small, rather simple-looking vase is actually most likely the first piece of porcelain that came to Europe. This was brought back by Marco Polo, and it's now in the treasury of the Basilica of St. Mark's in Venice. Why is it so extraordinary? Europe didn't know porcelain until this point. It's a totally foreign material to Europe. It was invented earlier on in China and Japan and used extensively there as a luxury material. But in Europe, the recipe of how to make vases or objects in porcelain didn't really exist. People had no idea how this material came about, how it was created. So from Marco Polo onwards, the fashion of these objects and the preciousness of these objects became very important in Europe. Another of these early objects is the Fonthill vase. The Fonthill vase arrives in Europe probably in the 14th century and belonged, to begin with, to King Louis the Great in Hungary. And it then passed on to the Duc de Berry and the great 18th century English collector William Beckford, who had it in his house at Fonthill in Wiltshire, which is why it's known as the Fonthill ewer. And you see it on the left as it was decorated probably in the 14th century, and how it is now. Unfortunately, all of the later decorations were removed. And you see the original Chinese vase, and this is now in the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin. But these very unassuming small objects really created the craze for this material in Europe and the importation of porcelain from both China and Japan into a number of European countries. What interests us today is the figure of Augustus the Strong of Saxony. Augustus the Strong was the elector of Saxony, but also king of Poland. So he's King Augustus II, known as Augustus the Strong, famed for his incredible strength. He was known to break horseshoe with his hands, a sort of iron horseshoe. And he was a great general in battle, but he was also a great lover of the arts, of luxury, of architecture. And he really transforms Dresden into one of the great European centers of the 18th century, assembling an incredible collection of decorative art objects, furniture, commissioning works of art, commissioning great buildings. And Augustus the Strong is one of the rulers of Europe who is particularly interested, if not obsessed with, porcelain. And he assembles a vast collection of Chinese and Japanese porcelain. This is mostly put together in a palace he has restructured, which is known as the Japanese Palace because of the Japanese shape of the roof of the building and the Chinese figures that decorate the courtyard and part of the facades. And in here, you have to imagine he put together this great collection of porcelain, which was really a collection of mostly Chinese vessels, such as these, or some Japanese ones. And these are all examples from the collection of Augustus the Strong. To give you an example of how precious porcelain was to Augustus, in 1717, in the spring of 1717, Augustus organizes a diplomatic exchange with the King of Prussia. And what he swaps is 600 Saxon and Polish soldiers in exchange for 151 vessels, Chinese vessels, which the King of Prussia had. So he's basically exchanging human lives, soldiers of his own army, which will go and fight for Prussia, in exchange for these objects, which is an extraordinary thing to do. These are some of the vases that came out of that exchange, Chinese vases, which are still to this day in the museum in Dresden and are known as the dragoon vases because of the dragoons that were swapped for them. Interestingly enough, many years later, that same group of dragoons found themselves fighting on the Prussian side against Saxony. So maybe on the long run, it wasn't such a fruitful exchange for Saxony, but the great vases entered the collection of Augustus the Strong, and that's what was mostly important for him. We have to think that between 1602 and 1657, the Dutch East India Company, which was one of the main trading companies that brought goods from Asia to Europe, brought into Europe about 3 million pieces of porcelain. Now, even though this number sounds like a staggering number, and of course it is, and even though China and Japan started producing export porcelain directed to a foreign European market, porcelain was still incredibly rare, and it was unbelievably expensive, and only the rulers and the top aristocratic families in Europe at that time could really afford pieces. And pieces as spectacular as these, as the dragoon vases, would have been owned by a very small number of people. The craze in the late 17th, early 18th century reaches high peaks, and many rulers all over Europe start creating porcelain rooms that are entirely covered floor to ceiling with porcelain vases and dishes. Now we focus on a German man who really was the person who changed the story drastically in the early 18th century. This man is Johann Friedrich Böttger. Butker was born in 1682 in the small town of Schleiz, and his family worked in the mint there. They were all involved with minting coins in different materials, in silver and gold. And Butker had a training as a chemist, as someone who mixed different elements and metals and worked with them. And he worked briefly with his family in the mint there. But he very quickly became fascinated by what was known at the time as the arcanum. And the arcanum is the mythical idea that a base metal, a type of cheap common metal, could be transformed through a series of chemical transformations into gold. We now know that that, of course, is impossible, or at least it's impossible to do easily. At the time, though, you can imagine that many rulers in Europe were fascinated by this idea because, of course, the possibility of transforming any kind of cheap material into gold would have made any of these rulers and any of these countries into incredibly powerful people and places. So Butker experiments with this. He becomes an alchemist. He works on the arcanum. And he's an interesting character. He's probably bragging about things, and he's probably a bit of a trickster in a number of ways. But a number of people witness that they've seen him perform this miracle. They've seen him perform base metal into gold. And so the king of Prussia is particularly interested, Frederick I is interested in this, and requires Butker to perform this action, this act in front of him and come to the court in Prussia. Butker instead flees. And he flees probably because, of course, he couldn't do it, and the whole thing was a trick. And he flees into Saxony. But in many ways, he falls from one trap into another, because the king of Saxony, well, the king of Poland and elector of Saxony at that point, Augustus II, is clearly equally interested in making gold as Frederick I is. And so Butker is effectively imprisoned in Saxony and obliged to work on the arcanum, obliged to work on the making of gold. And you have to imagine that at this point, porcelain doesn't really come into the story at all. Here is this man interested in metals and interested in the alchemical production of gold. And for Augustus, of course, having heard the rumors that Butker could achieve this impossible feat, Augustus keeps him clearly imprisoned and close by so that he can control this, with the hope that this solution will finance the wars and many activities that Saxony is involved with at that point. So Butker stays in Dresden, imprisoned, and after many failed attempts, of course, to make gold, he encounters another key figure in the story, Ehrenfried Walter van Tschirnhaus. And van Tschirnhaus was a mathematician. He was interested in glass production and mirrors, but he is also interested in porcelain. And he has been trying to make porcelain all along. And the meeting between Butker and Tschirnhaus produces the idea into Butker's head that maybe he should start working on that as well. And so while, of course, Butker's main job at the court in Dresden is to make gold for Augustus the Strong, he, on the side, starts working with Tschirnhaus on porcelain. And even after Tschirnhaus's death, he continues on this. Now, porcelain is made out, basically, of the combination of two materials, of kaolin and feldspar. And it is the combination of these two materials in China and Japan that provides the incredible white material clay that, fired at high temperatures and glazed and fired again, produces what we now know as porcelain. Now, these materials, similar materials, were available in Europe, but people did not know about the combination of those two. And so this is what Butker and Tschirnhaus had worked on. What materials, what type of clays do you mix to produce porcelain? And they reached a number of conclusions. And at this point, Butker is moved from Dresden into a nearby fortress, the fortress in Meissen, the Albrechtsburg, which is about 15 kilometers northwest of Dresden on the river. And here you see the fortress. The right part of this complex is the fortress. On the left, you see the cathedral and the Archbishop's Palace. But he is imprisoned in this effectively abandoned royal residence that's not particularly used by Augustus the Strong. And he's put there to keep working on both the arcanum and porcelain. So with the hope that he will find the recipe to make, if not gold, porcelain. He is there for about a year more or less. And it is while in Meissen that Butker gets close to the recipe. He manages to produce a reddish material that looks like some Chinese porcelains. But around this time, in the early 1700s, so around 1706, the Saxon court enters and Poland enter a very long and complicated war with Sweden. Worried about Butker in Meissen, the king imprisons Butker in a different fortress at Königstein. And this is the wonderful view of Königstein by Bellotto, the Venetian painter who worked at the court of Saxony. This is a great, wonderful painting, large painting in the National Gallery of Art in Washington. And you can see immediately from this painting how impregnable this fortress is and how impressive it was. So here Butker keeps working on the Arcanum, and only a year later he is moved back to Dresden. And he is moved into another military structure, the Jungfernbastei, the bastion, the Maiden's Bastion along the Elbe River in Dresden. And it is here in January 1708 that Butker discovers how to make porcelain. This is a sheet that survives in the archives in Dresden, where Butker is trying to present, you see sort of number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, the different combinations he's been trying. And he's been playing with materials like kaolin and feldspar. He's been working with alabaster as well and a number of local materials. And through this, in January 1708, he discovers a reddish material with which he can make what he thinks is porcelain. At that point, he inscribes over the doors of his cell in the bastion, God the Creator made a potter from a gold maker. So there is still this idea that he is still looking for gold, and that's effectively what he's trying to do. But as he's doing that, he really discovers porcelain. Now, what he discovers to begin with is red stoneware. This is a material that was also known at the time as red porcelain, but in fact is not specific porcelain as we think of it. Here is Butker in Meissen, in the castle in Meissen, experimenting. This is a fresco from the early 20th century showing him as he's producing porcelain. Butker, spending most of his life imprisoned in Dresden and outside of Dresden, was prone to severe depression, was drinking a lot, and of course you see him here with a large glass of beer in his hands, and he clearly led a particularly unhappy life. But in experimenting and in trying to find the solution for porcelain, he reaches results that no one had reached in Europe at that time. In March 1709, only slightly more than a year later, he actually discovers how to make white porcelain. And here's another fresco at Meissen where you see Butker showing his experiment and the results to King Augustus the Strong. What you see on the table to the left under the window is a number of pieces in this red stoneware, this red so-called porcelain, which is really the product that leads Butker to then discover white porcelain as we know it. In 1710, there is the first public showing of European porcelain. And the factory is at this point moved from the bastion in Dresden, where it was discovered, and transferred back to Meissen. And the factory will remain at Meissen from 1710 all the way until 1863, when it's finally moved out of the castle below in the valley in a purpose-built factory, which is where Meissen porcelain is still made to this day. So these are some of the very first objects made out of porcelain in Europe, and that's why they're so important. These are two wonderful small vases, very simple in their geometric forms, and you can imagine that they started with simple shapes and then developed into more complex shapes as time went by. And this instead is a Chinese teapot. And this shows you the similar type of material that was being produced in China and that Butker was trying to imitate. Now, this is a material that can be kept sort of rather rough, or can be polished. And here you see a Butker vase where parts of it are polished and parts of it are not. And we at the Frick are very lucky to have a substantial group of early Butker porcelain, which came from the gift of Henry Arnhold. This is the latest showing of some of these objects. You see them here on the right in the first bay. These are all simple vessels, vases, teapots, coffee pots, small sculptures that are all created around the early 1700s with this recipe of so-called red porcelain. Now, of course, what we're talking about today, the small teapots that I chose to discuss, relates to the arrival in Europe in the late 17th and early 18th century of three types of beverage which were unknown to Europe before that. And those are tea, coffee, and chocolate. Imagine life today without any of these three. But they all arrived from far away between the late 17th and early 18th century. Coffee came from Arabia, chocolate from South America, from Mexico, and tea, of course, from China. These beverages were so expensive and so rare in Europe that expensive tea, coffee, chocolate sets were made for rulers at the time. This, for example, is the golden coffee service, which was made by the court goldsmith in Dresden, Johann Dinglinger, for Augustus the Strong between 1697 and 1701. This is gold, precious stones, and the little cups that you see that may look like porcelain and in fact imitate porcelain are actually enameled gold. So none of the objects in this set is made out of porcelain. But as porcelain gets invented, of course, the idea is to create vessels for these beverages. And so this is how a wonderful teapot comes in place. Some of these objects are small because, of course, consumption of tea and coffee and chocolate is actually a very expensive pastime. So these are not large sort of vessels as we're used to them today. But of course, also these look back to Oriental Asian models. And there's a whole range of them. This is another teapot in red porcelain by Butker with some gold decoration that we have at the Frick. And this instead is a coffee pot that we also have at the Frick. And these are two similar examples, one of which is partly polished in Dresden, in the museums there. And these are more examples from Dresden. This is a beautiful little teapot with, again, parts that are polished and parts that are not. And this, another one that I particularly love, with, again, this geometrical pattern similar to the one at the Frick. And so this may look at first sight as a very simple object, but as I hope you understand, it really isn't. And what I love about this is that, you know, we think of the great masterpieces of the Frick and we tend to think of the great paintings, the sculptures, the pieces of furniture, but even something as simple and straightforward as this actually reveals to us an incredible story which changed the world we live in. So a little teapot like this actually is at the origins of a material which has become very common for us in Europe. Many people have porcelain objects in their house. It's a fairly common material today. And of course, drinking tea is something that we all do every day. Beyond the red stoneware that Butker invents, of course, as I said, only a year later, he moves back to what he finally invents and develops white porcelain. And this is a similar small teapot in white porcelain, an early Meissen object. We will meet in the next few weeks, and I will talk more about other porcelain objects. And I hope you're all enjoying your Saxon cocktail. Good evening.